welcome to One Man's Tracks, the secondhand music channel. I'm faced today with the rather difficult task of trying to briefly summarize the storied history of some of Northampton's most prolific propellers of musical progression, the introspective rock fusion pioneers that pushed the gothic post-punk wave of the early 80s and continue to create and perform with artistic integrity to this day. Let's get into the many creative sonic stylings of Daniel Ash, David J., and Kevin Haskins of Love and Rockets. Daniel and the Haskins brothers were longtime schoolmates and played in cover bands throughout high school. There they would become acquainted with their future Bauhaus collaborator, Peter Murphy. That band would last about 5 years from 78 to 83, and during which time they would produce many seminal works in their signature dark-glam gothic rock style. Bauhaus remains an influential staple in that field, but it just unfortunately won't be the subject of today's retrospective. There's no time for that, so we're going to have to learn about Peter on another day. Following that band's classic musical differences disbandment, Dan and Kevin would form the short-lived outfit called Tones on Tail with bassist Glenn Campling, a former roadie for Bauhaus. They would produce one record, Pop, as well as a number of great singles during that time together. While they were doing that, David J. put out a couple of solo albums as well as playing bass on a pair of Jazz Butcher releases before all three of them got back together for the formation of Love and Rockets in 1985. Getting the name from a popular alternative comic series, this tight-knit trio dropped their reflective, atmospheric, psychedelic rock debut, Seventh Dream of Teenage Heaven, in October later that year, getting followed up less than a year later by Express in September of '86, an even more driven, dynamic, free and philosophical record. It's a rewarding neo-psychedelic rock and roll ride that is an excellent sophomore effort. Just 1 year later, Love and Rockets would explore and expand upon a different shade of forward-thinking alt-rock with the more folk-centric, largely acoustic, poppier rock and reverberations of Earth, Sun, Moon in '87. 1988 saw the band's alien alter ego, the Bubblemen, releasing their soul single, The Bubblemen Are Coming, and I just wanted to point this out to show that the band did have a bit of a sense of humor to sort of offset that self-serious and brooding sound that they'd become associated with. Bringing us to 1989, ending off a tunefully abundant decade with one more release before the 90s. Released on March 7th through Beggar's Banquet Records, produced by John Fryer and the band. This is Love and Rockets' fourth and most commercially successful album. Their self-titled, gold and platinum certified Love and Rockets. As grateful as I am to have found it, this best-selling centerpiece of the L&R catalog sadly feels a bit like a disjointed afterthought when you compare it to their other efforts. While it still does contain a few catchy, moody rockers, even a #1 hit here in Canada, I can't imagine that Ash and DJ were even in the same room when they were writing these songs, because it just sort of trades back and forth between the two, one penning these more album-oriented rockers and the other going for a more bitter, introspective, even sludgier approach, and it just causes the whole thing to feel unfocused. Mixed messaging and foolish sequencing that only further emphasizes that split in focus leaves us with a fairly bipolar album listening experience here. That said, I still feel on an individual level there's quite a bit of character and sonic diversity, and I really enjoy the exploration that takes place on a fair few number of these songs, and so I still feel like it's worth getting into, worth diving through the nooks and crannies, the ups and downs of this oscillating album, and get into the tracks, but unfortunately it starts off with the clunky resentment of Jungle Law, and I really don't find this a very compelling start. I just don't think it's a smart way to kick off a record being pissed off about what others say about you. It isn't easy enough to identify with sentiment, but this vindictive eye for an eye attitude is a non-starter for me. I don't hate the tone of the tune or its cool industrial beat. I just can't stand the narrative and its sort of one-dimensional progression. The groovier, aloof, no big deal seems to handle Heartbreak with a lot more maturity than they did Critique. It's got a memorable hook, a danceable beat, but once again, narratively doesn't really cover a whole lot of ground. Placing the quiet, meandering jazz explorations of The Purest Blue next feels really odd, kind of opening up the record and cutting any momentum that might have been built up from those previous couple of songs. I really can't think of any other explanation for this song to be here other than to represent that sort of spacious, drifty sensation of the free and open road that we encounter on its follow-up, Motorcycle. Now here's a fun one, a song that I believe got split into two parts, probably for the sake of it staying a more simple, straightforward, driven, droning rock single. I feel like it's an influence for that great soundtrack song, Garbage Truck from Scott Pilgrim, or possibly even some influence on the band Black Rebel Motorcycle Club. This track, as well as its I Feel Speed cohort, do really well to express that simple pleasure of riding a crotch rocket. This latter half taking a step back, atmospherically floating along and reverberating in this big, comfortable, empty space, leaving us at the end of our ride in a meditative haze. Shifting from the weightlessness of the open road to a devilishly driven, nightmarish railcart on Bound for Hell. It's David J's reimagining of an old American folk ballad. They crank up the Americana and raucously swing their way down towards eternal damnation. A top-notch folk rocker that really does stand out amidst its surrounding dreamy, detached murmurings. I can understand wanting to cool off a little bit following that close encounter with Hellfire, but just the narrative for the Teardrop Collector doesn't match up well enough here to warrant this giant shift in tone once again on this album. It gets a little exhausting, the ups and downs here. I don't think the Teardrop Collector is a bad song, or I don't think its sentiment's bad at all. It's pleasant, it's got a really reassuring vibe, but honestly it is a bit redundant, a little extra after already having that Get Over It song, No Big Deal, come up earlier. Having multiple songs about moving on is pretty appropriate given the break the band took following the tour supporting this album. It having their biggest hit on it likely added a few more shows than they've been used to, with So Alive being modern rock Billboard charting #1 song for that whole year. A shimmering glam rock piece about the invigorating power of corporeal infatuation, a somewhat love at first sight track. It's a bit Bowie-esque and definitely very T-Rexian, as many have pointed out. It also has a nice tinge of funk with some lovely ladies singing some backup vocals on it as well. I know hindsight's 2023, but had I been in charge of this album's track list, I probably would have started with So Alive and likely would have closed the whole thing out with the subsequent sweet string sections of Rock and Roll Babylon. Not only to avoid all the comparisons piling on at once, as this track has Beatles worship written all over it, but also I just feel like its thoughtful imagery leaves us with such a lovely and reflective sentiment to close out this record. But alas, we end with No Words, No More. Thankfully, not a terrible closing song either. The title is very appropriate for a finisher. In kind of typical L&R fashion, it carries with it this dark, gothic rock twinge that really makes it all more compelling than your standard bluesy alternative fare. It's that variability right there that helps me get over this super frustrating, vacillating track list. Love and Rocket's ability to imbue their music with an original tonality is and was enough to elevate this album to higher heights than any other Bauhaus associated project ever, and was certainly enough to get me interested. It may not have aged quite as well as some of the others, but thanks to its uniqueness and widespread sales, I was able to get introduced to over 40 years of forward-thinking, underappreciated musical history. I still have so much material to get through from these talented gentlemen, like, for example, the stuff they got up to in the early 90s before they came back in 1994 with that semi-ambient, psy-trancey follow-up, Hot Trip to Heaven. The band lost all their gear and nearly their lives in a fire while they were recording Sweet F.A. in Rick Rubin's studio in '96. That eventually came out as a more stripped down, dark return to guitar-based sound that I found just a little too dry. Maybe the rawness will grow on me, but I still do appreciate the band taking on a slightly different alternative angle with that one as well. With Bauhaus returning to the stage in the late 90s, Love and Rocket's seventh and final release came in the form of 1998's Lift. Another more electronically focused release that I also don't think has aged all that well, but was probably quite a blast when it came out. Maybe it's of its time, or maybe I just haven't given it the time it needs to fully appreciate that either. But either way, it's back to Bauhaus. Their on-again, off-again relationship lasted up until one last Bauhaus release in 2008, Go Away White, that I have actually avoided listening to entirely in order to not maybe taint those previous Bauhaus releases that I've really enjoyed getting into thanks to this. But if someone recommends it to me in the comments, I'll 100% check it out as well. Jumping all the way to 2017 now, when Kevin and Dan reunited with Kevin's daughter Diva as bassist to perform their old material under the name Pop Tone. Peter and David J. reunited for a 40th anniversary Bauhaus tour in 2018, and Bauhaus was planning on going on tour last year, but Peter had to return to rehab, so those shows were cancelled, and now there's a Love and Rockets reunion tour that's starting in just a couple months. I believe the first show's in May, so get excited. Love and Rockets are back. Let me know if you're planning on seeing them live on this tour, or if you have any fond memories of seeing them back in the 80s or 90s. Any favorite solo projects I ought to check out, or just any memories or thoughts on L&R, cool little tidbits you'd like to share. I'd love and Rockets to hear about it down in the comments. I've linked this album as well as my own tracklist version down there for you to shop and compare, and here's a couple other albums I think you might enjoy. Check them out. I've reviewed them there and there. Subscribe for more throwback retrospectives. Like if you made it all the way to the end. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next one. Take good care.